Mercenaries from the depths of the purging flames surrounded them. Well, one sneered, "This is the end for Jin." In response, Jin and Na readied themselves for battle. The mercenaries chuckled, eager to finally face Jin. One of them sighed in relief, glad they'd soon be leaving the forest. Jin adjusted his magical accessories, confident that Esther and the others hadn't yet noticed the mercenaries' presence. One of the mercenaries pointed toward Nino, warning the others not to harm her, saying she might still prove useful. Another mercenary eyed Jin, making a disturbing comment about his appearance, already plotting something sinister. But then, he hesitated as if realizing something unsettling. For a brief moment, it crossed his mind that the mercenaries might have gone mad, poisoned by something in the forest. Without warning, all the mercenaries rushed forward, launching an attack on Na and Jin. Jin quickly shielded the girl encountered, driving his blade into one of the mercenaries. Yet a lingering doubt gnawed at him. Was it already too late to fix this? Suddenly, a mercenary appeared behind him, swinging a sword. Jin spun around just in time, deflecting the strike. With a swift motion, he conjured a fiery orb and hurled it at the attacker. Meanwhile, another mercenary closed in, ready to strike Jin down, but Na intervened. She leaped into the air, striking the man's leg, forcing him to scream in agony. Determined to finish him off, Na prepared to attack again, but before she could, someone grabbed her from behind, causing her to cry out in pain. Jin spun around, his heart racing with fear as he saw one of the mercenaries pinning Na down. The mercenary leaned in close to Nina's face, demanding that she stop resisting, insisting that everything happening was Jin's fault. With a sickening grin, he even threatened to have some fun with her before dealing with her fate. Jin was already moving to shove the man off Na, but she, with a fierce glare, shouted at Jin not to worry about her. Without hesitation, Na struck the mercenary hard, making him cry out in pain as she pushed him off, her expression filled with disgust at the man's stench. Another mercenary crept up behind Na, his blade ready to pierce her. Sensing the danger, she spun around and launched a powerful water blast straight at him. Grabbing him by the hair, she slammed her fist into his face, knocking him back. "Don't come near me again." She yelled at the mercenaries, her voice filled with warning. Jin couldn't help but stare, amazed at how Na could strike fear into them so effortlessly. From the side, a mercenary with an eye patch shouted that Jin and Na were just a couple of kids, unaware that another man behind him had already knocked him out cold with a blow to the head. At that moment, Dan and Esther emerged from the bushes. Dan shouted a warning to the mercenaries, telling them to prepare for an incoming attack. The mercenaries froze, stunned to realize that Jin and Nina had backup all along. Jin's forces quickly encircled the mercenaries. Esther, swift and precise, lunged with her spear, taking down multiple foes at once, while Dan skillfully swung his sword, cutting through the ranks. The mercenaries collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. Dan grinned with satisfaction, thrilled by how nimble his body had become thanks to Jin's enhancements. After a brief but intense battle, their enemies were defeated. Jin's companions approached him, asking if he was all right. Jin reassured them, telling them he was fine and suggested reviving the remaining mercenaries for questioning. However, Nina refused, visibly disgusted, saying she didn't want to touch them. Jin, determined, insisted they could handle it on their own. The surviving mercenaries were tied up and lined before him. Jin's gaze hardened as he stared them down, his expression fierce. He announced that it was time for an interrogation and made it clear he had plenty of questions. He promised that if they answered truthfully, the consequences would be less severe. Jin emphasized that he had no desire to lay a hand on them, unless he had to. Jin approached the blindfolded mercenary and calmly told him that drinking the truth serum would make things easier for everyone. But the man spat the serum out, grinning defiantly at Jin, mocking him without fear. Jin's gaze darkened, but before he could react, Esther stormed forward, thrusting her spear into the mercenary's knee. His scream pierced the air, and Esther, unfazed, coldly remarked on how quiet the mercenary had suddenly become. She then turned to her brother, asking what they should do next. With a chilling suggestion, she proposed they start by tearing off his fingers, one by one. Twisting the spear deeper into the man's leg, she added that if they wanted him to talk, perhaps the only thing they'd leave untouched would be his tongue. The other mercenaries looked on in horror, disgusted by Esther's brutal treatment of their leader, pleading for them to stop. One of the men revealed that they had been trained since childhood in the art of torture, learning to inflict maximum pain without killing too quickly. Jin, unfazed by the revelation, glared at their leader, demanding to know their numbers. The leader stayed silent, refusing to give in. Without wasting another moment, Jin turned away and confidently approached the rest of the mercenaries. His voice steady, he declared there was nothing they could do to stop him. Grabbing one of them by the head, the mercenary shrieked in terror. Ignoring the man's pleas, Jin demonstrated his mastery over fire magic, warning that he could slowly raise the heat until it became unbearable. The mercenary begged for his life, his fear escalating as Jin calmly explained how the thin skin on his scalp would soon start to heat up. Jin's words were chilling, painting vivid images of severe burns and the unbearable pain that could lead to shock and death. He made it clear there were many ways this could end. Glancing at the other mercenaries, Jin compared them to the very monsters they hunted, implying they were worth just as little. The mercenary under Jin's hand screamed, pleading for mercy and promising to tell Jin everything. Satisfied, Jin released him and stepped back, giving the man a moment to catch his breath. The mercenary stared at his hands, wondering if he'd been burned, trembling at the thought of what might have happened. Jin, now calmer, decided it was best if Na didn't witness any more of this. Suddenly, one of the other mercenaries cursed and shouted at Jin, refusing to believe he could defeat them so easily. He taunted Jin, saying the exit from the labyrinth was heavily guarded, even outside the prison. He claimed no one from Jin's team would escape. Dan, intrigued, questioned the mercenary about the way out of the labyrinth. Realizing that his comrades were unaware of the full situation, the mercenary grudgingly began to spill all the secrets, knowing they had no other choice. Dan declared that the mercenaries had betrayed their guild. He warned them that the ambassadors at the labyrinth's exit would judge them partially, and he assured them that their clan would be utterly destroyed. Dan grimly stated that all the mercenaries would face torture before being executed. At best, they could hope to be enslaved. As he examined them, he promised to testify against them in court, and sternly ordered them to stay silent if they didn't want to make matters worse. The interrogation continued relentlessly. Jin accused the mercenaries of lacking the spirit and courage to act for the good of the Nazar nation. It became clear that Jin's forces were no longer under their captor's control. They uncovered that the mercenary clan had been formed by Nazar with the purpose of spying and stealing from one of the stakes. Even more surprising, the merchants they had targeted were also undercover scouts, aiming to weaken the stake's influence. The mercenaries had been advised to recruit skilled adventurers for their operations, but after completing their tasks, everything spiraled out of control, far worse than anything Jin had anticipated. One of the mercenaries was visibly shaken when he mentioned something about the gift of empathy. He revealed that, with its power, they had been able to extract information from Dan's mind about the guild. As they dug deeper, Dan's demeanor tensed. Ironically, the mercenary admitted that Dan had unknowingly fed them vital details about the guild and its plans. The interrogation took a dark turn as the mercenary disclosed that one of their comrades had gone mad due to the mental strain caused by Dan's subconscious resistance. Jin reflected on the mental assault that had occurred when the mercenary tried to invade Dan's mind. He wondered if the mercenary had somehow overloaded his own mind in the process. Jin remembered the time he and Dan had consumed the truth serum and suggested that it might have contributed to the mental backlash. Dan approached the man, asking if one of the mercenaries truly suffered because of it. The man simply responded that it didn't matter anymore. Noticing Dan's clenched fists, Jin asked him what had happened. Meanwhile, the sound of battle echoed from the floor below, where robed soldiers were fighting off the monsters attacking them. The man stated that 2 hours would pass in what felt like 10 seconds. The entire unit swiftly took battle positions, ready for the next challenge. Suddenly, a wyvern appeared, and the squad quickly used magic to bring it down. As the creature fell, the squad leader grinned, wondering if the second squad had really been captured, seemingly unaffected by the unknown threat. The leader, gifted with foresight, remained unshaken by the presence of the mages. A stone golem lumbered forward, carrying a cage filled with mercenaries from outside the prison. As it moved alongside Jin, the golem spoke, stating it finally understood Jin's clever plan to use the golems to their advantage. Jin had devised a strategy to create two separate prison areas, each transported by the golems. One for those who would quickly confess, and the other for those who resisted. The cages themselves were a stark contrast. One was outfitted with soft blankets, while the other was lined with sharp thorns. The food was also divided. One group received rancid meat, while the other got mouth-watering smoked delicacies. To top it off, Jin's forces had slipped a special potion from the Namlan family into the drinks to prevent dizziness. Jin's ultimate goal? To stir up jealousy among the prisoners in better conditions. The team soon found themselves amidst chaos as the mercenaries began cursing and yelling. Ian grinned, praising Jin for his meticulous planning. Jin, however, was already focused on the next challenge. Most of their troops were low-ranking members, and without his careful arrangements, they would have struggled to manage the situation. Jin had even thought of something as small as bathroom facilities. Despite the difficulty, he provided specially designed undergarments with built-in storage, what he jokingly called diapers from another dimension. Still, the smell soon became unbearable, forcing them to use air curtains, which, although effective, proved to be quite the hassle. Esther admitted that her brother was indeed special, but she insisted that even he couldn't pull off something like that. Jin chimed in, explaining that without a lot of mana, it would be impossible. He reminded the squad that they still needed to support the golems. Esther approached her brother, playfully suggesting he should learn from her how to deal with bad people. She waved off the idea, brushing it aside as something not worth learning, and Jin agreed with a nod. Suddenly, Ian sensed something and glanced at Jin, who immediately acknowledged it, saying he too felt something strange. He warned the group that a large number of people, driven by a strong desire to kill, were approaching. Recognizing this as the arrival of the first squad, Dan turned to Jin, asking what their strategy would be this time. He was eager to know his role. Jin, after listening to the prisoners, identified the most troublesome members of the first squad, the leaders, Forbes, and Neville. He insisted that these two mercenaries must be taken down. They mentioned that Neville's power was better suited for the second squad, but he had a sharp ability to assess the situation. Jin reassured them, adding that there was no need to worry. Neville could only use his ability if they were within his line of sight. Jin suggested they strike before Neville could analyze their stats, neutralizing him before he became a real threat. Jin gathered the group for a briefing on Forbes, the leader of the first squad. He explained that Forbes could burn through all his mana in seconds, but in doing so, he gained the ability to predict the future. Jin emphasized that it was this foresight that allowed Forbes to climb to S rank. To counter this, Jin advised the team to exploit the first squad's long-range attack capabilities, and he made it clear that they would need to maximize the use of water magic. He assigned Esther and Nina to take the front near the prison and back him up with their magic. Jin's plan was to strike the enemy's mages quickly, cutting off their ability to attack from a distance. To aid the team, Jin handed out magical glasses, explaining that they would allow the squad to identify their enemies' names and skills, giving them a critical edge in battle. As the first squad marched through the dense forest underbrush, Forbes spotted Dan and immediately began mocking him. He taunted Dan, questioning if the guild, who was supposed to stay out of this, was really backing a wizard. Dan shot back, saying the second squad had already told him everything. Jin, watching closely, warned that the first squad was in serious trouble if they didn't surrender. With a calm but commanding tone, Jin assured the mercenaries that if they cooperated, their lives as slaves would be far better than anything they could expect otherwise. Then, without further hesitation, Jin cast a spell. The air became thick with tension as everyone waited anxiously, knowing something terrible was about to happen. After a tense pause, Forbes calmly smoothed back its hair, expressing a desire to escape the labyrinth and live a peaceful life. However, His tone quickly darkened, becoming more threatening as he declared that this would be the end for him. Jin's eyes widened, and without hesitation, he unleashed a massive wave of water magic toward the first squad. Caught off guard, many were swept away by the powerful surge. As the water subsided, the first squad struggled to get back on their feet. Nidal cursed as he tried to stand, but Jin was quick, using an air cutter spell to immobilize him. Furious shouts erupted from the squad, all aimed at Jin. Forbes wiped his face and, with a smirk, admitted that he should have seen it coming. But the attack had been too sudden. He raised his sword high, commanding the first squad to charge at Jin and his allies. His target? The guild leader and the children. Dan and Ian moved to the front lines, clashing with the enemy in fierce combat. Jin, locking eyes with Forbes, shouted his name and swung his sword in a powerful strike. Forbes dodged with ease, gracefully avoiding the blow. Undeterred, Jin attempted to hit him with a water balloon spell, but Forbes sidestepped once again, grinning mockingly. He taunted Jin, claiming he'd never land a hit before he could counterattack. Realizing that direct attacks were futile against Forbes' ability to anticipate them, Jin recalled the advice from the second squad. Forbes wasn't skilled in fencing. Instead of focusing on landing a hit, Jin decided to wear him down, refusing to give him any time to recover. As the battle raged on, Jin's thoughts briefly flickered to Esther and Na, who were supposed to be assisting him. Meanwhile, the first squad faced off against Na and Esther. Tension crackled in the air as both sides braced for confrontation. But as the mercenaries charged forward, the wet ground, slick from the earlier water magic, caused the entire first squad to stumble and fall. Confusion spread as Forbes tried to make sense of what had just happened. Jin grinned, realizing their plan had worked. He'd used a special jelly made from boiled slime which had been spread during the giant wave attack. A mercenary shouted in frustration, claiming it was unfair. Esther, noticing that the group intending to attack her brother was now within range, began launching air cutters at the first squad. At the same time, Na raised his sword and summoned a fierce windstorm. Dan and Ian quickly took advantage, pinning the mercenaries to the ground. Dan smirked and told Jin that they were finished. Back in the thick of the fight, Jin continued to battle Forbes. At one point, he taunted Forbes, asking what had happened to his squad and whether he planned to help them. Forbes, focused on deflecting Jin's strikes, knew that if he lost focus for even a second, Jin would finish him. He was desperately trying to figure out how he could use his foresight to turn the tide of the battle. But as the fight wore on, Forbes found himself surrounded, realizing he had no way out. Jin, sensing his hesitation, mockingly asked Forbes to use his foresight. What did he see in the future now? Forbes, breathing heavily, dropped his sword and fell to his knees, placing his hands behind his head in surrender. With a bitter chuckle, he admitted defeat. The mercenaries from the second squad, shocked at Forbes' sudden surrender, began begging for mercy, offering to share any information they had. They couldn't believe that Forbes, their leader, had given up so easily. Esther remarked that they now had more than enough prisoners and witnesses. She asked Jin if they could tie the captives to trees and let monsters deal with them. But Jin shook his head, explaining they might still need them. He added that Forbes, in particular, deserved special treatment. They prepared the best cage for Forbes, who was lifted by the stone golem. Jin then informed everyone that they were heading to the 30th floor, to a safe zone, but warned that it would be freezing there. He told Forbes he'd give him some warm clothes. Forbes, uncertain, thanked Jin, albeit reluctantly. Jin continued, saying he'd also provide Forbes with water as much as he needed. Forbes chuckled lightly, responding that it wasn't something he needed to worry about. Meanwhile, the mercenaries trapped in the cage cursed at Forbes, blaming him for their predicament. As the troops and the stone golem made their way through the forest, Ian spoke up, letting everyone know they were close to the safe zone. He then turned to the group and asked how they planned to explain all of this to the other clans. Jin considered this and suggested they simply tell the truth. Even though there were scouts on the 30th floor, he acknowledged there was still a risk of running into trouble. However, Jin believed they should make it clear to everyone that this was how things had to be. He proposed the idea of befriending the other clans. Dan stepped forward, volunteering to explain the situation, offering his position as guild leader to help smooth things over. Jin thanked him for that and turned to the rest of the group, advising them not to provoke any of the other clans during their interactions. Soon after, Jin encountered Leon, who smiled and asked what had been going on. Jin rubbed the back of his head, admitting that it had been a while since they last saw Leon, and confessed that it would take some time to explain everything that had happened. Dan approached Leon and said he'd take care of explaining the details. Leon immediately recognized Dan as the guild leader. Dan then explained that, besides the prisoners, they had been hunting down Jin. Leon, taken aback, asked what he meant by that. Dan explained that, being mercenaries, they had been contracted to hunt Jin. The real culprit behind the chaos was the mastermind. The mercenaries overheard this conversation, muttering angrily among themselves, wondering what they were supposed to do now. Forbes stared intently at Leon, his expression shifting as he caught sight of a man from the third squad. His eyes widened in realization. One of them had been quietly blending in with the other clans. Forbes knew they couldn't afford to let Jin advance any further. In his mind, the 30th floor represented their last chance to stop him. As he began contemplating what he might do once free, Jin suddenly turned to face him, catching Forbes off guard. Forbes, momentarily stunned, locked eyes with Jin. His expression tensed as he muttered to someone nearby, insisting that there was still time. Sensing the unease, Jin asked what was going on with Forbes. Forbes opened his mouth to speak, but Jin cut him off, yelling that if Forbes revealed what he knew, it would cause everyone to panic and lead to their deaths. Jin, growing more suspicious, demanded to know if Forbes had used his foresight. Before Forbes could respond, a voice from the shadows shouted for Jin to die. Suddenly, Jin's forces were ambushed by mercenaries from the third squad, Purgatory. The chaos erupted around them, the battle intensifying in an instant. All the witnesses turned to ash. The third squad, hiding among the people, launched a surprise attack on the adventurers, shouting for the witnesses to be burned. The adventurers screamed in agony. Jin quickly cast a water spell, creating a barrier to shield himself from the flames. A man from the third squad, furious, yelled that everything was Jin's fault, accusing him of destroying their clan. Jin looked at the man, unfazed, realizing that the man was blinded by rage, even willing to sacrifice his comrades and fellow elders. Despite the man's frenzied accusations, Jin remained calm. He saw no need for words. Instead, he stepped forward and delivered a swift, decisive blow. The man's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the ground. Jin then gave the command to capture the remaining suspects. His forces immediately moved in to arrest the mercenaries, calling for Yin. Jin ordered him to heal Leon, who lay injured on the ground. Yin rushed over, directing Esther and Na to assist him. As Jin looked down at Leon, he realized how naive he had been. He hadn't accounted for how far desperation could push someone. If he had anticipated this, the elders wouldn't have suffered, and the situation wouldn't have spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, the mercenaries approached Dan, pleading for him to listen. Though they were now free, they swore they had no knowledge of the killings. They begged for his trust. Dan, sensing manipulation, suggested they were being used for someone else's gain. He offered them a chance to prove their innocence by helping bring the real culprits to justice. He advised them to avoid the labyrinth for the time being and focus on simpler tasks like dismantling and cleaning up. The mercenaries, visibly worried about their lack of funds, apologized but expressed their gratitude to Dan for his healing and magical remedies. Dan acknowledged that, thanks to everyone's efforts, including the Elder Tree, no lives were lost. The mercenaries expressed their gratitude once more and offered their apologies. Leon approached Jin, reaffirming that they, as adventurers, were fully capable of protecting themselves. Dan then instructed all the wounded to return to the surface and give their testimony. Leon offered to help but made it clear he couldn't forgive anything beyond confinement. He then asked what they planned to do with the captured mercenaries. Dan turned, gazing at the captured mercenaries, and remarked that their sins had only grown heavier. He wondered aloud what kind of punishment awaited them. One of the mercenaries recalled how they had stolen vital information and understood the consequences would be severe. Together with the golems and mercenaries, the troops began their ascent to the surface, treading over the cold stone floors. Jin kept a small flame burning in his hand to light the way, while the mercenaries carried torches in their cages. Forbes, who had been sitting frozen inside his cage all this time, now stirred. When they reached the exit, the knights greeted them. Their commander stepped forward, curious how they had made it there. One of the men answered that the journey had been smooth and thanked them for welcoming his troops. The mercenaries wept tears of relief, grateful they had survived. The commander then asked if these mercenaries were the suspects outside of custody. Jin looked over at the group and explained they were linked to the Nazar nation. He mentioned that a battle had broken out because of this, resulting in many deaths. He added that there were still enough witnesses left to tell the tale. The commander smiled, assuring him they would handle the prisoners and interrogate them properly. Turning to Jin, the commander asked if he wanted to recount the entire story in one sitting at the guild. Seeing his men exhausted, the commander allowed them to rest. Jin, finally sitting on his bed, reflected on how far they had come and how they had survived such a long and grueling battle. Na smiled, remarking that after using a sleeping bag, her bed now felt even softer. Jin chuckled, looking at her, and said that the entire squad had been terrified of leaving custody. He reassured her that they were staying at the best and safest hotel. Ian, glancing at his companions with a half-smile, added that the country was footing the bill for their accommodations. He mentioned they could stay here for an entire month. Gizin voiced no objection, considering the current situation. Esther chimed in, reminding them that they hadn't anticipated being attacked. She also brought up Dan and the truth serum case, which she found rather inconvenient. Before she could continue, Jin cut her off, telling his sister they still had plenty of work to do. He suggested they all get some rest. Everyone agreed and turned in for the night. The next day, Jin had a meeting with Daniel Funk, the Duke of the Kingdom of K. Daniel greeted him warmly, clearly relieved to meet him. He explained that he was handling the matters related to their custody. Jin felt a bit anxious in the presence of such an important figure. He responded hesitantly, saying he was also glad to meet Daniel. Casually eating a pastry, Daniel commented that Jin seemed approachable and suggested they skip the formalities. Flashing a grin, Daniel reassured Jin there was no need to worry. Though Jin nodded in agreement, he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's calm demeanor bordered on rude. As they continued talking, Daniel revealed that he and Dan were from the same family. Jin began to understand their behavior a bit better. Daniel explained that Dan came from a poorer branch of the family, being the fifth son of a concubine. Dan didn't have the money for schooling as a child and spent his days wielding a sword in the fields. Daniel shared that, as a child, he often managed things at Dan's home, acting as a go-between for the family. He went on to explain how, despite the Funka family recognizing Dan's potential, Dan always rebelled. He refused to become a follower. At the age of 12, Dan disappeared, embarking on his journey as an adventurer in Gale before eventually starting his own business. Daniel expressed his concern that Dan might be expelled from the guild and urged him to return, offering various high-ranking positions. While Dan seemed to consider it a reasonable option, Jin was skeptical of its value and declined the offer. Despite this, Daniel reassured Dan that he wouldn't give up on him. Jin, sensing that Duke Funko was determined to bring Dan back, wondered if Dan could handle the weight of such responsibility. Daniel then revealed that all evidence linking those outside custody to the Nazar nation had been presented in court. He sought input from both Dan and Jin on how to handle the participants involved. Jin suggested eliminating them to prevent any potential retaliation. Dan shared that after intense interrogation and torture, the participants' assets had been seized. He proposed selling those assets and donating the funds to the Elder Tree as compensation. Once they were formally sentenced, the state court would take over their punishment. Jin, still curious, inquired about the status of Marquis Pell, assuming he was still gathering intel. Daniel assured them not to worry. Pell had been arrested. He explained that Pell had been caught trying to take their servant hostage and had leaked information under pressure. However, unlike before, Pell no longer held any valuable secrets. His fate would be determined after sentencing. Daniel then shifted the conversation, revealing that due to Nazar's aggression and the impact of Jin and Rosa's espionage, King Kola had decided to launch an attack on both Nazar and Rosard. Jin and Dan were stunned by this revelation. Jin immediately questioned the reasoning behind such an attack. Daniel speculated that it might be more for show than strategy. He also mentioned that Poodle's body had been sent to Rosard, which made Jin realize that securing Gale, the largest city, was crucial for victory. With Dan likely to be removed from his position, the guild was in dire need of new leadership. Daniel then turned his attention to Jin, asking how he felt about the situation. Apologizing for the delay in the conversation, Daniel explained that there were certain matters he couldn't discuss in Dan's presence. Jin reassured Daniel that everything was fine. Daniel then mentioned that he had previously suggested Dan visit the fan house, knowing that this was a tough situation for him, even though Dan didn't openly show it. Daniel believed that Dan was struggling after being expelled from the guild and losing his adventurer rank. He expressed concern that without his former status, Dan might face ridicule from unsavory characters. Jin agreed, recognizing Dan's combat skills, and questioned why Dan had been removed from the guild in the first place. After thinking it over, Jin proposed the idea of forming a new clan, with Dan starting at a lower rank as a form of punishment. They also considered petitioning the king for a pardon on Dan's behalf. Daniel agreed to sign the petition, convinced that it would carry more weight with their names attached. He promised to return with the results in a few days. A few days later, Daniel returned, greeting Jin as a regular adventurer and happily agreeing to work for the clan. Jin quickly stopped him, feeling that Daniel was being too formal. Daniel explained that thanks to the petition, Dan had admitted his mistakes and was pardoned from further punishment. However, Dan would now have to serve in the new clan for 5 years. He added that the guild didn't want to lose someone with Dan's abilities. Dan clarified that he had voluntarily resigned to reduce the impact of his situation. Jin wondered aloud if they might need a new guild leader soon. At that moment, 2 women approached. Daniel announced that Cammy would serve as the interim guild leader until a permanent replacement was found, citing her status as the wife of a famous adventurer. Jin jokingly remarked that Dana had been forgotten, prompting Dan to angrily silence him. Dan then expressed his gratitude to Jin and Daniel for their help, laughing at the embarrassment of his situation. Jin asked Dan what his next move would be, noting that the new clan still didn't have a name. Dan agreed to help and asked Jin to train the servants so they could match the strength of those in the capital, as they needed someone to organize them. Jin suggested providing them with magical items and accompanying them to the slime prison. Dan agreed, recalling how he had discovered many magical stones there. Jin also received a discount on a house purchase from a nobleman, thanks to Dan's release from prison. With a deep sigh, Dan asked why Jin needed so much money. Jin explained that he had run out of funds because he kept spending it to help someone, though he admitted it might not yield any results. Daniel smiled, remarking that they first needed to deal with the aftermath of Dan's imprisonment. He then requested Jin to accompany him to the trial. Jin understood that the outcome was already certain, even though this was just the initial hearing. During the trial, Jin was called to testify, standing in the center of the courtroom. He recounted how, while searching the tropical labyrinth, he had accidentally overheard a conversation about a plan to capture him. The person speaking had broken down in tears, confessing their fear of being targeted by more experienced adventurers. Jin tried to convey the anxiety and fear he felt when recalling those moments. The judge listened intently, then commented that Jin's description painted all the suspects as ruthless individuals. Moving on, the judge declared that, due to years of attacks on the Kingdom of Coal, a verdict had been reached. The mercenaries would be punished with 1,000 lashes, continuously healed to endure the full sentence. In addition, their faces and hands would be tattooed to mark them as serious criminals. On top of that, they were sentenced to a lifetime of forced labor as criminal slaves. The courtroom erupted in agreement, many voicing their approval that the mercenaries were receiving their just deserts. A man clad in armor then began speaking out against the mercenaries with sharp criticism. Jin noticed him and, curious, asked Dan who the man was. Dan glanced over and identified him as Herbert, the head of a clan.